For 8 years, I dedicated my heart and soul to saving my husband's struggling family vineyard. During a harvest celebration, he casually told his relatives, "Grace is just temporary until we get back on our feet." What happened over the next 3 days transformed not just the business, but everyone's understanding of exactly who I am. I still remember the weight of the wine glass in my hand when I heard those words. The crystal caught the setting sun, scattering light across the long harvest table where 3 generations of the Sullivan family had gathered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The vineyard stretched out behind them, rows of vines heavy with grapes that I had spent years nurturing, back to health. Grapes that would soon become award-winning wine. Because of me. The conversation had drifted to the future of Sullivan Estates, as it often did during family gatherings. Robert, my husband of 8 years, stood to propose a toast. His grandfather had started the vineyard with nothing but determination and a small plot of land. His father had expanded it into a respectable local business, and Robert had nearly lost it all before I arrived. "To family," he said, raising his glass. The crystal clinked as everyone joined the toast. "And to the future of Sullivan Estates." His mother, Gloria, beamed with pride. "We've come so far in the past few years. Remember when we thought we might have to sell?" Robert nodded, a practiced humility softening his features. "It's been a journey, but we're finally getting back to where we belong." "Well," his cousin Tom interjected, "Grace deserves a lot of credit. The new cultivation techniques, the marketing strategy, she's been instrumental." I felt a small glow of appreciation. Tom had always recognized my contributions, even when others hadn't. Robert's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said, placing his hand on my shoulder. The weight of it felt suddenly unfamiliar. "Grace has been helpful during this transition period. But Sullivan Estates has always been about family, about legacy." His father, Arnold, nodded sagely. "Blood runs deeper than anything else in this business." "Exactly," Robert continued, his grip on my shoulder tightening. "Grace is just temporary until we get back on our feet. The Sullivans have always found their way back to prosperity." The words hung in the air like the last note of a discordant song. I felt every eye at the table shift toward me, gauging my reaction. Some with embarrassment, others with a strange satisfaction, as if a question they'd long wondered about had finally been answered. Temporary. After 8 years of marriage, after the sleepless nights spent researching sustainable farming practices, after convincing local restaurants to feature our wines when Sullivan Estates was on the brink of bankruptcy, after redesigning the entire customer experience at the vineyard to boost tourism revenue, after postponing my own dreams of starting a small artisanal cheese business to complement the wines, I was temporary. I maintained my composure, years of navigating difficult business negotiations coming to my aid. I smiled, took a sip of wine, our award-winning Cabernet, the one I had insisted we produce despite Robert's concerns about the cost, and let the conversation move on to other topics. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. That evening, as guests departed and the sunset painted the vineyard in shades of gold and crimson, Robert's Aunt May approached me. She had always been something of an outsider herself, having married into the Sullivan family 40 years ago. "They don't see it yet," she said quietly, her weathered hand patting mine. "How much of this place is actually you now?" I looked at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "I recognize the signs," she continued. "When I married Arnold's brother, they treated me the same way. Like I was just passing through their precious family history." She gestured toward the main house, a stately Victorian that had been renovated under my supervision. "But you've done what I never could. You've put your stamp on this place in ways they can't erase." I thought about the heritage apple orchard I'd planted on the eastern slope, the lavender fields that now drew tourists year-round, the tasting room redesign that had been featured in Wine Country Living. My contributions weren't superficial. They were woven into the very fabric of Sullivan Estates. Yet, to Robert and his family, I remained an outsider. Temporary. As I helped the staff clear the tables, I caught sight of Robert in deep conversation with his father and uncle. Their heads were bent together, voices low, expressions serious. I knew that look. Business was being discussed, family business, and as usual, I wasn't included. Yet to Robert and his family, I remained an outsider, temporary. As I helped the staff clear the tables, I caught sight of Robert in deep conversation with his father and uncle. Their heads were bent together, voices low, expressions serious. I knew that look. Business was being discussed, family business, and as usual, I wasn't included. Later that night, I stood at our bedroom window, looking out over the moonlit vineyard. Robert was already asleep, untroubled by the words he had spoken. Perhaps he didn't even realize their impact, or perhaps he had simply voiced what he had always believed. Either way, the truth had been revealed, not just to me, but to everyone who mattered in our social and business circles. I was not considered a permanent part of the Sullivan legacy, despite everything I had built here. I watched the silver light play across the vines, plants that had thrived under my care after years of neglect. I had arrived at Sullivan Estates when their yields were down and their reputation was fading. Robert had been desperate then, willing to try anything, including listening to my ideas. But as success returned, so did the old family attitudes. The subtle dismissals, the closed-door meetings, the gradual erasure of my contributions. As I stood there, I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue as I had been, pouring my heart and expertise into a business that would never truly be mine. I could leave, taking my knowledge and skills elsewhere, or I could do something else entirely. The vineyard stretched before me, acres of carefully tended vines that I knew better than anyone else on the property. I knew which blocks produced the best fruit in which years. I knew the subtle soil variations across the valley floor. I knew the secrets that had turned Sullivan Estates from a failing family business into a rising star of the wine region. And I knew something else too, something that Robert and his family had apparently forgotten. My name wasn't just on the marriage certificate. It was on the business loans that had saved Sullivan Estates from foreclosure. It was on the trademark applications for our new wine series. It was on the deed to the 20 additional acres we had purchased 2 years ago. I wasn't just Robert's wife. I was a full legal partner in Sullivan Estates Vineyard and Winery. Temporary? I don't think so. As the realization settled over me, I felt a strange calm replace the hurt and anger. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about business. And business was something I understood very well. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would begin to reclaim what I had built. I turned from the window, my decision made. Robert slept on, oblivious to the transformation taking place beside him. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. I wasn't born into the world of wine. My parents owned a small bookshop in a coastal town 3 hours from wine country. My childhood smelled of paper and ink, not earth and grapes. But I had always been fascinated by transformation, the way things could change from one form into another with the right knowledge, patience, and care. Perhaps that's why I fell in love with winemaking long before I fell in love with Robert Sullivan. We met at an agricultural conference where I was presenting research on sustainable farming practices. I had just finished my master's degree in agricultural business management, focusing on boutique crop optimization, making small farms more profitable through strategic planning. Robert approached me after my presentation, looking lost in his expensive suit among the academics and field experts. "I'm not sure I understood everything you talked about," he admitted with a charming smile. but I think you might be exactly what our vineyard needs. He told me about Sullivan Estates, founded by his grandfather in 1948, expanded by his father in the 1970s, and now struggling to compete in a changing market. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He described 100-year-old vines, unique microclimates, and generations of family knowledge. He also, rather reluctantly, admitted that the vineyard was 3 months away from having to sell to a large corporate winery group. "We're asset-rich but cash-poor," he explained over dinner that evening, "and we're stuck in the old ways of doing things." I was intrigued by the challenge. A historic vineyard with good bones but outdated practices. It was exactly the kind of project I had trained for. When Robert invited me to visit Sullivan Estates for a consultation, I agreed immediately. The vineyard was even more beautiful than he had described, and in even worse shape. The main house was magnificent but deteriorating. The equipment was outdated. The vines were stressed from years of conventional farming that had stripped the soil of nutrients. The tasting room was stuffy and uninviting, attracting few visitors despite its prime location. But I also saw the potential. The terroir, that mystical combination of soil, climate, and topography, was exceptional. Some of the older vines, though neglected, could produce extraordinary fruit if properly tended. The property had natural features that could be enhanced to create unforgettable visitor experiences. "I can help you," I told Robert and his father after 3 days of assessment, "but you'll need to be open to significant changes." Arnold Sullivan, then 68, looked skeptical. "This vineyard has survived for 3 generations doing things our way." "With all due respect," I replied, "it's not surviving now." I laid out a 3-phase plan: immediate cost-cutting measures to stop the financial bleeding, transition to organic farming practices to improve wine quality and marketability, and a complete reimagining of the visitor experience to boost direct-to-consumer sales, which carried the highest profit margins. "This won't be easy," I warned them, "and you won't see full results for at least 3 years." Robert looked at his father. Something unspoken passed between them, the acknowledgement that they had no better options. "What would this cost us?" Arnold asked. "My consulting fee is $50,000 per year, plus a percentage of increased profits," I said. I had calculated carefully, knowing they were cash-strapped, but needing to establish my value from the beginning. "That's impossible," Arnold scoffed. "We can barely make payroll." Robert had been quiet, studying me with those intense eyes that I would later come to know so well. "What if we offered you something else instead?" he asked. "I'm listening." "Partnership," he said. "A stake in Sullivan Estates. Help us save this place, and you'll own part of what you build." Arnold looked alarmed, but Robert continued. "We need more than advice, Grace. We need someone with skin in the game. Someone who'll be here day after day, making sure these changes happen." It was a compelling offer, risky, but with potentially greater rewards than a consulting fee. And there was something about the land, about the challenge, about Robert himself that called to me. 20%, I countered, and I wanted in writing. After tense negotiations, we settled on 15% ownership, with provisions for that percentage to increase based on the vineyard's performance. The paperwork was drawn up, and I moved into the guest house at Sullivan Estates 2 weeks later. Robert and I worked side by side that first year. The attraction between us grew naturally, late nights poring over financial projections, early mornings walking the vineyard, shared victories as our changes began to show small results. He proposed 11 months after I arrived, on a hilltop, overlooking the newly replanted East Vineyard. "You've saved more than the business," he said as he offered me his grandmother's ring. "You've brought life back to this place, to all of us." I believed him then. And for several years after, our marriage and business partnership seemed perfectly aligned. We complemented each other, Robert handled relationships with distributors and longtime clients, while I focused on vineyard management, wine production, and building our direct-to-consumer business. The improvements came slowly at first, then gathered momentum. We won our first regional gold medal for our Pinot Noir in year 3. By year 5, our organic certification was complete, and our wines were being featured in high-end restaurants across the state. In year 6, Wine Enthusiast gave our Reserve Cabernet a 94-point rating, and suddenly Sullivan Estates was on the map in a way it hadn't been for decades. Along the way, I continued to expand my own knowledge. I took viticulture courses, studied with world-class winemakers during the off-season, and built relationships with progressive growers who shared my vision for sustainable, terroir-driven wines. I also invested my inheritance from my grandmother into purchasing adjacent land that I knew had exceptional potential for growing the Rhone varietals I believed could be Sullivan Estates' next frontier. What I didn't fully appreciate during those years of growth was how the family dynamics were shifting beneath the surface of our success. As the vineyard prospered, Robert began spending more time with his father and uncle, reviving old family traditions and business connections. The Sullivan way began to reassert itself, sometimes in subtle opposition to my more innovative approaches. Family dinners increasingly featured stories of the old days, with pointed reminders of how the business had survived countless challenges. Before I arrived, new ideas I proposed were met with more resistance, often countered with, "That's not how we do things here." And I noticed something else. As Robert grew more confident in our success, he began taking credit for decisions and strategies that had been mine. In interviews with wine publications, the narrative gradually shifted from our vision to his vision, with my contributions mentioned as supportive rather than foundational. I told myself it didn't matter. Results mattered. The vineyard was thriving, our marriage was solid, and eventually, the family would have to acknowledge that my outsider perspective had been exactly what Sullivan Estates needed. But there were warning signs I chose to ignore. The separate bank account Robert maintained for family matters, the business meetings scheduled when I was away at conferences, the way Gloria, my mother-in-law, still referred to me as Robert's wife, rather than by my name when introducing me to their social circle. I was so focused on building something meaningful that I missed the subtle indications that the Sullivans still saw me as temporary, a useful addition during crisis, but not truly part of the legacy they were protecting. Until that harvest dinner, when Robert said the words aloud and finally made the family's perspective unmistakably clear. The morning after the harvest dinner, I woke before sunrise, a habit formed over years of vineyard work. Robert was still asleep, one arm flung across the space where I had been. I watched him for a moment, searching his face for the man I had fallen in love with. He looked peaceful, unburdened. My temporary status clearly didn't weigh on his conscience. I slipped out of bed and dressed quietly in work clothes, sturdy pants, boots, and a light sweater against the morning chill. Harvest season was always my favorite time at Sullivan Estates. The culmination of a year's work, the promise of transformation held within each perfectly ripened grape. I had always found a certain poetry in it, the way patience and care were rewarded, how even difficult years could produce exceptional wines in the right hands. Outside, the vineyard was shrouded in mist, the rows of vines emerging like shadowy sentinels as I walked the gravel path between blocks. This particular section, 8 acres of Cabernet Franc that I had insisted on planting despite Arnold's skepticism, was scheduled for picking today. I moved between the vines, checking clusters, feeling the weight of the fruit in my palm. Perfect sugar levels, ideal phenolic ripeness. These grapes would make exceptional wine that would bear the Sullivan name, not mine. I reached the eastern ridge where the land opened to a view of the valley below. Other vineyards dotted the landscape, their geometric patterns catching the first golden light of day. Among them were operations run by friends I'd made over the years. Kara Dixon, whose all-female winemaking team was gaining national recognition, Mac Donovan, who had transformed his family's bulk wine business into a boutique natural wine producer, Amara Wilson, who had started from nothing and now owned 300 acres of prime vineyard land. All of them respected me as a peer, as a skilled wine grower and businesswoman. Only within the Sullivan family was I still Robert's wife first, temporary help second. What would these colleagues say if they knew? The thought brought heat to my face. I had worked too hard, accomplished, too much to be dismissed so easily. A voice called my name, interrupting my thoughts. Chloe, our assistant winemaker, was making her way up the path. I had hired her 2 years ago, fresh from her enology degree, recognizing in her the same passion for innovation that had driven me. Under my mentorship, she had developed into an exceptional talent. "Morning," she said, slightly breathless from the climb. "You're out early." "Checking the cab, Frank," I replied. "We'll start picking here around 8. She nodded, then hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "About last night." My stomach tightened. So she had heard Robert's comment. Of course she had. She'd been helping serve dessert. "It's fine," I said automatically. "It's not," Chloe insisted. "Everyone knows this place wouldn't even exist anymore without you." Robert's comment was... She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable criticizing the owner's son. "Revealing," I finished for her. "But not surprising." Chloe looked relieved that I wasn't falling apart. "What will you do?" The question caught me off guard. I was still processing, still forming a plan. But Chloe's direct inquiry forced me to articulate what I had been thinking all night. "I'm going to do what I've always done," I said. "Take care of this vineyard. Make exceptional wine. The only difference is I'm no longer going to let anyone else take credit for my work." Chloe studied me, then nodded. "About time." She glanced at her watch. "The picking crew will be here in an hour. I'll make sure everything's ready at the crush pad." As she walked away, I felt a wave of appreciation. Despite the Sullivans' perception, I wasn't alone here. I had built my own team, earned loyalty through respect rather than family obligation. Back at the main house, activity was already underway. Harvest season meant early starts and long days for everyone. In the kitchen, I found Gloria preparing coffee and a light breakfast for the family and core staff. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of the strong black coffee. "The cab. Frank is ready. We'll start there today." Gloria nodded absently. "Robert mentioned he wants to hold the Merlot another week." "The Merlot is already pushing optimal ripeness," I countered. "Another week and we risk losing acidity. We need to bring it in tomorrow." She looked at me with that particular expression I'd come to know well, polite but dismissive. "Well, you can discuss it with him when he comes down." He and Arnold were up late talking about harvest logistics. Harvest logistics, without me. Despite the fact that I had personally managed the last 7 harvests while Robert focused on sales, I took a slow breath. The picking schedule was finalized. "Last week, the crews are already arranged. Plans change," Gloria said with a tight smile. The men were looking at the long-range forecast. "There's a heat spike predicted next week that could concentrate the flavors in the Merlot. Or destroy the balance we've been cultivating all season," I said, my patience thinning. "This isn't a guessing game, Gloria. It's science and experience." Before she could respond, Robert entered the kitchen, already dressed for the day in crisp khakis and a button-down shirt, his gentleman farmer look that he wore when wine club members were scheduled to visit. "Morning," he said, kissing me quickly on the cheek before pouring his coffee. "Big day. The journalist from Wine Country today is coming at 11. I want to show him the new fermentation tanks." "The ones I researched and selected," I said pointedly. Robert blinked, then smiled as if I'd made a small joke. "Right. Our new tanks. Also, I've invited the Harringtons to dinner tonight. James is considering a significant wine club order for his corporate clients, the Harringtons, of course. James Harrington owned a regional insurance company and fancied himself a wine connoisseur. His wife, Abby, was Gloria's bridge partner and a notorious gossip. They were exactly the kind of people Robert enjoyed impressing: wealthy, connected, and easily dazzled by the trappings of wine country life. "I've got a late night planned with the harvest," I said. "The picking will go until sunset, and then I need to oversee the crush." "Can't Chloe handle it?" Robert asked, adding cream to his coffee. "This dinner is important. James could place an order worth $50,000. I thought about the delicate process of managing the first crush of the season, setting the tone and standards for everything that would follow. "I need to be there." Robert's expression tightened slightly. "Grace, this is business. The wine will still be there tomorrow." "This is business," I countered. "The most important business. Without perfect fruit handling, there is no exceptional wine to sell to the Harringtons of the world." We stared at each other across the kitchen island, at an impasse. Gloria busied, herself with breakfast preparations, pretending not to listen. Finally, Robert sighed. "Fine. I'll tell Abby you send your regrets. Again." The implied criticism was clear. In the Sullivan family hierarchy, socializing with potential high-value customers took precedence over actual winemaking, image over substance, appearance over reality. It was a fundamental difference in our approaches that had once seemed complementary, but increasingly felt antagonistic. Robert believed in the Sullivan name, the legacy, the story. I believed in the land, the vines, the wine itself. "I'll make it up to you," I said. Not because I believed I needed to, but because it was easier than prolonging the argument. Robert nodded, his good humor apparently restored. "Oh, and Dad wants to discuss the blending plan for the reserve wines. He has some ideas about increasing production this year." Increasing production of our reserve tier, our highest quality, lowest yield wines, would mean lowering our standards, diluting what made those wines special. It was exactly the kind of short-sighted decision that had led Sullivan Estates to trouble before I arrived. "We'll see what the vintage gives us," I said diplomatically, though inside I was seething. "Quality comes first." "Of course," Robert agreed easily. "But we should be ambitious. Last year's reserves sold out in 3 months. We're leaving money on the table." I finished my coffee, buying time to compose my thoughts. "I need to check on the picking crew. We can discuss the reserves later." As I headed for the door, Robert called after me. "Don't forget about the journalist. 11 o'clock. Wear something nice." I paused, my hand on the doorknob. Something nice meant the camera-ready wine country outfit that Robert preferred for publicity. Artfully casual linen, tasteful jewelry, hair and makeup done. The costume of a vineyard owner's wife, not the practical clothes of someone who actually worked with the vines. "I'll be there," I said without turning. I know how important the Sullivan image is. I let the door close behind me with perhaps a bit more force than necessary and headed toward the crush pad where the real work of harvest was about to begin. Each step I took felt more determined than the last. Something had shifted inside me. For years, I had compartmentalized these slights, focused on the work itself rather than the recognition. I had told myself that results mattered more than credit. But now I understood that by allowing the Sullivans to minimize my contributions, I was complicit in my own erasure. By prioritizing harmony over acknowledgement, I had helped create the very situation I now found intolerable. No more. Starting today, Grace Sullivan would be temporary no longer. The harvest day unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of the season. Picking crews moved efficiently through the vineyard rows, their practiced hands selecting only the perfect clusters. Tractors hauled bins of fruit to the crush pad, where each load was inspected before processing. The air filled with the sweet, earthy scent of ripe grapes and the mechanical hum of equipment. I moved between tasks with practiced efficiency, checking fruit quality, adjusting the destemmer settings, monitoring fermentation temperatures in tanks containing yesterday's picks. This was where I belonged, not playing hostess at another Sullivan dinner party, not smiling politely while Robert explained his winemaking philosophy to people who couldn't tell Merlot from Malbec. At precisely 10:45, I reluctantly left Chloe, in charge, and went to change for the journalist's visit. In the bedroom, I found that Robert had laid out an outfit for me, a cream-colored linen dress and the turquoise necklace he'd given me for our 5th anniversary. The gesture, once something I might have found thoughtful, now felt presumptuous, another small way of controlling my presentation to the outside world. I deliberately chose something different. Dark jeans, boots I could actually walk the vineyard in, and a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Professional but practical. I did concede to the necklace, a silent compromise. When I arrived at the winery building, Robert was already chatting with the journalist, Christopher Walsh from Wine Country Today. I recognized him from industry events, a knowledgeable writer, with a genuine appreciation for the craft. "And here she is," Robert announced as I approached, "my wife Grace, who handles much of our day-to-day operations." Much of our day-to-day operations, as if I were the office manager rather than the winemaker and vineyard director who had transformed the entire operation. "Grace Sullivan," I said, extending my hand to Christopher. "Head winemaker and vineyard manager. It's nice to meet you formally." A flicker of surprise crossed Robert's face at my direct self-identification, but he recovered quickly. "Grace is being modest. We all wear many hats here at Sullivan Estates. It's a family operation. I understand you've made some significant changes to the vineyard management since joining the team," Christopher said to me. "The shift to organic practices must have been challenging." "It was," I confirmed, "especially convincing the family that short-term pain would lead to long-term quality improvements." I smiled at Robert. "Change isn't always easy in a multi-generational business. But worth it in the end," Robert added smoothly. "Dad was skeptical at first, but now he's our biggest advocate for the organic approach." This was a complete reinvention of history. Arnold had fought me on the organic transition every step of the way, convinced it would lead to crop losses and diminished yields. Only when the improved fruit quality became undeniable, and the premium prices that quality commanded, had he reluctantly acknowledged the success of the approach. "Speaking of your father," Christopher said, "I understand he's still actively involved in the business. Is he available to join us today?" Robert shook his head. "Unfortunately, he had a prior commitment, but he sends his regrets." Another fabrication. Arnold was likely at the clubhouse of his golf course, as he was most days by mid-morning. His active involvement consisted mainly of second-guessing my decisions and reminiscing about the good old days of conventional farming. "I'd be happy to show you the vineyard," I offered, steering the conversation away from family mythology. "We're in the middle of harvest, so you'll see everything in action." For the next 2 hours, I led Christopher through a tour of Sullivan Estates, from the century-old vines in the heritage blocks to the new plantings of Rhone varietals I had championed. I explained our water conservation systems, the cover crops that built soil health, the beneficial insect habitats we had established to reduce pest pressure naturally. Robert stayed close, occasionally interjecting with comments about family tradition and honoring the past while embracing the future. But I noticed Christopher's attention remained primarily on me, his notebook filling with my technical explanations and philosophy. "The Sullivan name has been synonymous with this valley for 3 generations," Robert said as we reached the crest of the eastern vineyard, the valley spread out below us. "There's something special about tending the same soil your grandfather worked. Though, interestingly," I added, "this particular vineyard block wasn't part of the original Sullivan property." I gestured to the flourishing vines around us. This was the adjacent Johnson property until 4 years ago when we acquired it. It had been conventionally farmed for decades, depleted and underperforming. We've completely rehabilitated the soil and replanted with varietals better suited to its specific microclimate. Which varietals? Christopher asked, pen poised. Primarily Grenache and Mourvedre, I replied. I believed this elevation and exposure would be perfect for Rhone varieties, despite some uncertainty from the family. I glanced at Robert. These vines produced their first commercial crop last year, and the resulting wine earned a 96-point score from Wine Advocate. Robert's jaw tightened slightly. The Sullivan tradition of excellence continuing into new territory, he added. Who made the decision to acquire this land? Christopher asked, looking between us. Before Robert could answer, I spoke clearly. It was my initiative. In fact, I purchased this parcel personally before transferring a half-interest to Sullivan Estates. Robert's head snapped toward me, surprise and something like alarm crossing his features. This wasn't a fact we typically shared with outsiders, that I personally owned a significant portion of what was presented as Sullivan land. A joint venture between marriage and business partners, Robert said, his voice overly casual. One of the many ways Grace has contributed to our growth. Christopher nodded, making another note. And who is the winemaker for the Rhone program? Specifically? I am, I said firmly. From vineyard to bottle, the Rhone series is my project. With the full support of the Sullivan tradition behind it, Robert added. The pattern was becoming almost comical in its predictability. Each time I stated a clear fact about my role or contribution, Robert would append some comment about family tradition or the Sullivan legacy, as if my work could only exist within the framework of Sullivan validation. As we walked back toward the winery, Christopher asked about future plans. I understand Sullivan Estates has acquired water rights to the North Valley parcel. Any plans to expand plantings there? This was news to me. Water rights to the North Valley? That would be a significant acquisition, one that would allow for expansion into previously undevelopable land. And apparently, these discussions had happened without my knowledge. We're always looking toward the future, Robert said smoothly. Dad has been in discussions with neighboring properties about water access, but nothing is finalized. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was seething. Major business decisions being made without consulting the person responsible. For vineyard operations, it was beyond insulting. It was deliberately exclusionary. Any expansion would need careful planning, I said, looking directly at Robert. Water management is critical to our sustainability commitments. I'd want to review any proposals thoroughly before moving forward. Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, the Sullivan family takes sustainability very seriously. The Sullivan family, I repeated, letting the phrase hang between us. Not we or Sullivan Estates, but the Sullivan family. The distinction drawn yet again. By the time we finished the tour and tasting with Christopher, the tension between Robert and me was palpable, though we both maintained professional facades. As we walked the journalist to his car, he thanked us both. This has been incredibly informative, he said. Grace, your technical knowledge and vision for the property are impressive. And Robert, the family history adds such rich context to the wines. I think my readers will be fascinated by how Sullivan Estates balances tradition and innovation. We're grateful for your interest, Robert said. The legacy continues with each generation. And evolves, I added pointedly. Wine is a living thing, after all. It can't remain static. After Christopher drove away, Robert turned to me, his expression tight. What was that about? What was what about? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. You know what? Making it sound like you're solely responsible for everything good. That's happened here. This is still Sullivan Estates, my family's business. Is it? I countered. Because last night you made it very clear that I'm just temporary in this family business. So which is it, Robert? Am I an essential part of Sullivan Estates? Or am I just passing through? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I knew well. You're twisting my words. I was just emphasizing the family connection to the business. The history. No, I said firmly. You were drawing a line between family and not family, between permanent and temporary. And after 8 years of marriage, after saving this business from bankruptcy, after creating the wines that restored the Sullivan reputation, I'm still on the temporary side of that line. Robert looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand why I was upset. You're my wife. Of course you're important. Important isn't the same as essential. It isn't the same as respected. I turned toward the winery where I could see the harvest activity continuing. I need to get back to work. The temporary help has a vineyard to run. I walked away, leaving him standing there. Each step I took felt like a declaration of independence, a small rebellion against years of subtle diminishment. For the rest of the day, I immersed myself in the harvest work, directing the processing of the Cabernet Franc, checking fermentations, preparing for the next day's picks. I skipped dinner with the Harringtons, sending Chloe in my place to discuss the technical aspects of winemaking if questions arose. Late that evening, as I was finishing the day's work in the lab, my phone rang. It was May, Robert's aunt. I heard about the journalist visit today, she said without preamble. Gloria's complaining that you contradicted Robert several times. I sighed, leaning against the lab counter. I simply stated facts about my role in the business. Good, May said. Surprising me. It's about time. Listen, Grace, there's something you should know. The family had a meeting last night after you went to bed. My stomach tightened. What kind of meeting? The kind where Arnold talks about succession planning and preserving the Sullivan legacy. They're concerned about your increasing influence over operations, especially after the Wine Advocate score for your Grenache blend. My increasing influence? I repeated incredulously. I've been running operations for 8 years. Yes, but always under the guise of supporting Robert's vision. Now that you're being recognized independently, they're uncomfortable. May's voice lowered. Arnold suggested it might be time to restructure your role. Make it more ceremonial. Ceremonial. The word hit me like a physical blow. They didn't just see me as temporary, they saw me as disposable. A convenient assistant during hard times, but an inconvenient presence now that success had returned. Did Robert agree with this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. May's silence was confirmation enough. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. Just watch yourself, May advised. They won't make any moves before the end of harvest. They need you too much right now. But afterwards, she trailed off, leaving the implication clear. After we hung up, I stood motionless in the silent lab, the familiar sense of wine and chemicals surrounding me. Outside the window, the floodlights illuminated rows of tanks containing this year's harvest, wines that might not even be under my supervision. By the time they were bottled, the realization was crystallizing now, hardening into certainty. This wasn't just about recognition or respect anymore. This was about my livelihood, my future, my professional identity. The Sullivans weren't just dismissing my contributions, they were actively planning to remove me from my position. I had been patient. I had been accommodating. I had subordinated my own recognition to the Sullivan legacy for 8 years, and now they planned to thank me by pushing me aside. I picked up a glass beaker, measuring it in my palm. 8 years of my life. 8 years of my expertise, creativity, and hard work. 8 years I could never get back. My grip tightened until my knuckles whitened. Then, deliberately, I set the beaker down instead of throwing it against the wall, as part of me wanted to. I wouldn't react with emotion. I would respond with strategy. It was time to review exactly what legal protections I had, and what leverage I could use to secure my future, with or without the Sullivan name attached. The next morning brought the kind of crystalline autumn day that photographers love to capture for wine country calendars: golden light filtering through morning mist, leaves beginning to turn crimson at the edges, the mountains sharp against, a cloudless sky. On any other day, I would have paused to appreciate the beauty. Today, I barely noticed. I'd slept in the winery guest house, telling Robert via text that late-night lab work made it more practical to stay there. The truth was, I couldn't bear to lie next to him, pretending everything was normal when I now knew what was happening behind my back. Instead, I had stayed up past midnight, digging through my files for every contract, amendment, and legal document related to Sullivan Estates that I'd accumulated over the years. By sunrise, I had a clearer picture of my position, and it was more precarious than I'd realized. Yes, I owned that 15% stake in the business we'd negotiated when I first arrived. Yes, I personally owned half of the Eastern Vineyard that was now producing our highest-rated wines. But I had never formalized my position as head winemaker or vineyard manager with an actual employment contract. In my naivety, I had trusted that marriage and shared business interests were protection enough. I arrived at the main winery building earlier than usual, before any of the Sullivans would be awake. The harvest crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. I needed this time alone to think, to plan. In my office, a small space tucked behind the lab that I had claimed years ago, I pulled up the winery's financial records. As both part owner and the person who had restructured the accounting systems, I had complete access. What I found confirmed my suspicions. New accounts had been created in recent months. Large sums had been transferred with vague descriptions like business development and future planning. None of these transactions had been discussed with me, despite my ownership stake. I downloaded the records to my personal computer, then began searching through the digital archive of meeting minutes. Sure enough, several meetings of the Sullivan Family Trust had occurred recently, a separate legal entity I had helped establish years ago, but was not personally part of. The minutes were sparse on details, but mentioned evaluating operational restructuring and brand continuity planning. Corporate euphemisms for pushing me out. I was so absorbed in my discovery that I didn't hear the door open behind me. "You're here early." I jumped, turning to find Arnold standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his stance that seemed defensive. "Just getting a head start," I said, casually closing the financial records on my screen. "Lot to do during harvest." He stepped into the office, glancing at my computer. "Anything interesting in the numbers?" The question was too pointed, too knowing. Had he guessed what I was looking at? Just checking crush projections against tank. "Capacity," I lied smoothly. "We're going to be tight if the Merlot and Syrah come in at the same time." Arnold nodded, but his eyes remained suspicious. "Robert mentioned you, and he had some disagreements yesterday during the journalist visit. So, that's what this was about, a fact-finding mission. Not disagreements," I said carefully. "I simply made sure the writer understood my role here. The wines that are receiving recognition are primarily my creations. That's just fact, Arnold." His expression hardened. "Sullivan Estates has been making fine wines for generations, long before you arrived." "And it was nearly bankrupt when I joined," I countered. "Let's not rewrite history." We stared at each other for a long moment, the pretense of casual conversation abandoned. "This vineyard is Sullivan legacy," Arnold said finally. "Everything here exists because my father had the vision to plant those first vines, because I expanded through the hard years, because Robert has maintained the family traditions, and because I modernized outdated practices, introduced sustainable farming, and created wines worthy of international recognition," I added. "I've earned my place here, Arnold." He shook his head slowly. "You've contributed, yes, but you've never understood what Sullivan Estates truly represents. It's not just a business. It's a family heritage. A heritage I've helped preserve and enhance, I said. Temporarily, he replied, echoing his son's word from the harvest dinner. Now that we're stable again, it's time for Sullivan blood to lead Sullivan Estates forward. There it was, the confirmation I hadn't wanted but needed to hear directly. My suspicions weren't paranoia. They were planning to sideline me. I'm not going anywhere, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. I'm not just Robert's wife. I'm a business partner with legal standing. Arnold's expression shifted to something almost like pity. Grace, don't make this difficult. We're prepared to be more than fair. A generous settlement, continued use of the Sullivan name for your personal projects if you wish. But the direction of this company will be determined by family. I am family, I insisted. For 8 years. Marriage is not blood, he interrupted coldly. And marriages end. The words hung in the air between us, their implication unmistakable. This wasn't just about my role in the business. They were prepared to sacrifice Robert's marriage if that's what it took to remove me from Sullivan Estates. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. Emergency at Crush Pad. Tank 7 pressure alarm. Need you ASAP. I have to go, I said, gathering my laptop. We can continue this conversation later. Arnold stepped aside to let me pass. Think carefully about your next steps, Grace. Some battles aren't worth fighting. I hurried to the Crush Pad, my mind racing faster than my feet. When I arrived, Chloe was already addressing the tank issue. A minor pressure buildup easily resolved by releasing the valve. Thanks for handling it, I said, helping her complete the adjustment. No problem, she replied, then lowered her voice. I didn't actually need you. I saw Arnold go into your office and you looked trapped. I stared at her, surprised by both, her perception and her loyalty. You've been good to all of us, Grace, she said simply. We see what's happening here. At that moment, looking at this talented young winemaker who had become both protege and ally, something crystallized within. Me? This wasn't just about my position or pride anymore. It was about standing up for everything I had built, not just wines and vineyards, but relationships, trust, a way of doing business that valued people and quality above family mythology. Sullivans had made their position clear. Now it was time for me to make mine. I spent the rest of the morning in a fog of disbelief and anger, going through the motions of harvest supervision while my mind processed Arnold's words. Marriage is not blood, and marriages end. The threat had been clear. Either I accept a diminished role, or they would encourage Robert to end our marriage. By noon, I needed space to think. I told Chloe I'd be checking the remote vineyard blocks, and drove my truck to the furthest corner of the property, an isolated knoll overlooking the valley. I used to come here in the early days when the struggle to turn Sullivan Estates around had seemed overwhelming. The perspective had always helped clear my mind. I sat on the tailgate, the autumn sun warm on my face despite the chill in my core. How had I been so blind? I'd convinced myself that excellence would eventually earn acceptance, that results would speak for themselves, that the Sullivans would eventually see me as an essential part of their legacy. But they never would. To them, I would always be an outsider, temporary, dispensable. I pulled out my phone and stared at Robert's last text from this morning. Where are you? We need to talk. No apology, no acknowledgement of what his father had just laid out to me. Just the expectation that I would make myself available when summoned. Had he known about Arnold's plan to confront me? Was he in agreement with the strategy? To push me out? After 8 years of marriage, I realized I wasn't certain. The Robert I thought I knew, the man who had looked at me with admiration and gratitude during those early turnaround years, seemed increasingly distant, replaced by someone more concerned with the Sullivan name than our partnership. My phone rang. It was Kara Dixon, my friend who ran the all-female winery operation down the valley. Just checking if we're still on for that coffee tomorrow, she said when I answered. I'm not sure, I admitted, my voice rough with emotion. Things are complicated right now. She was silent for a moment. Grace, what's wrong? You sound terrible. The concern in her voice broke something inside me. I found myself telling her everything. Robert's temporary comment, the discovery of secret financial dealings, Arnold's thinly veiled threat about our marriage. Those manipulative bastards, Kara said when I finished. After everything you've done for their precious vineyard. I don't know what to do, I confessed. I'm part owner, but they have majority control. They're determined to push me into a figurehead role now that the business is successful again. What does Robert say about all this? She asked. That's the worst part, I replied. He's not standing up for me. He's allowing it to happen, maybe even helping plan it. The realization hit me with fresh pain. My husband, the man I had sacrificed for and supported, wasn't just failing to protect me. He was likely complicit in my professional diminishment. Come over, Kara insisted. Right now. We need to talk this through properly, and you shouldn't be alone. An hour later, sitting in Kara's stylish office at Dixon Wines, surrounded by awards her all-female team had earned, I felt a confusing mix of emotions: betrayal, anger, fear, but also the first glimmer of resolve. They think they can just discard. You, Kara said, pouring me a glass of her award-winning Chardonnay, after you literally saved their business. They're counting on me caring more about the marriage than my professional role, I said. They think I'll accept a settlement to keep the peace. And will you? She asked directly. The question hung in the air. 6 months ago, I might have said yes. Even yesterday, I might have been unsure. But after hearing Arnold's cold dismissal of my contributions and his willingness to sacrifice his son's marriage for family control, something had fundamentally shifted inside me. No, I said finally. I won't. Good. Kara nodded approvingly. So, what's your next move? I took a sip of wine, the crisp acidity helping to sharpen my thoughts. I need to understand exactly where I stand legally, and I need to figure out if my marriage is worth fighting for. Do you still love him? Kara asked gently. I stopped, genuinely uncertain. I love who I thought he was. Who he was when we started this journey together. But that person wouldn't have let his family diminish me this way. My phone buzzed again with a text from Robert. Where are you? Family dinner tonight. Important business to discuss. The timing was almost comical. Important business. Presumably the continued discussion of how to remove me from operational control while maintaining access to my expertise until they could replace me. I think I need to see an attorney, I said, making my decision. Before I faced them again, Kara immediately reached for her phone. I know exactly who you should talk to. Abby Winters. She specializes in both business law and divorce, particularly in the wine industry. She helped me structure my buyout of my ex-husband's share of Dixon Wines. As Kara made the call and arranged for me to meet with Abby first thing tomorrow morning, I felt a weight simultaneously lift from my shoulders and settle in my heart. This was really happening. I was preparing for battle against the family I had spent nearly a decade trying to become part of. You can stay with me tonight if you need space, Kara offered after hanging up. I shook my head. I need to be at the vineyard. Harvest doesn't stop for personal crises, but thank you. Just remember, Kara said as she walked me to my truck. You made Sullivan Estates what it is today. Don't let them rewrite that history. Driving back to the vineyard in the late afternoon light, I composed a response to Robert's text. Working late. Won't make dinner. We can talk tomorrow. His reply came quickly. Grace, this is important. Dad has concerns about your access to financial records. So they knew I had been looking at the accounts. Good. Let them worry about what I had found. I'm sure he does, I texted back. We'll discuss it tomorrow, with my attorney present. I turned off my phone after sending that message, not wanting to see his response. Instead, I focused on the road ahead, the vines passing in neat rows on either side. Vines I had nurtured, trained, and coaxed into producing world-class fruit. When I reached the winery, the day's harvest was being processed. I threw myself into the work, checking fermentation progress, tasting juice samples, making technical decisions about yeast strains and maceration times. This was my domain, my expertise, regardless of the Sullivan name on the building. As sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, I climbed to the winery roof, a private spot where I sometimes came to reflect at day's end. Below me, Sullivan Estate spread out in all its glory, the achievement of 3 generations of Sullivans and 8 years of my life. For the first time, I allowed myself to really feel the pain of betrayal. Not just professional betrayal, but the deeper personal wound of realizing that my husband, the man I had loved and supported and believed in, had failed to value me as an equal partner in both marriage and business. Tears came then, hot and angry, finally breaking through the shock and disbelief that had carried me through the day. I cried for the marriage I now realized might be beyond saving, for the years spent believing I was building something lasting, for the naive hope that excellence would eventually translate to acceptance. But as the tears subsided, something else rose to take their place, a steely determination that dried my eyes and straightened my spine. If the Sullivans wanted a fight, they would get one, and they were about to discover that the woman they considered temporary had become more permanent and more powerful than they had ever imagined. Dawn found me back at the guest house, showered and changed after spending most of the night in the winery. I had slept barely 3 hours, but my mind felt more alert than it had in months, perhaps years. It was as if a fog had lifted, allowing me to see the patterns that had been forming around me all along. I was reviewing my notes for the meeting with attorney Abby Winters when my phone rang. Robert's name flashed on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Where have you been?" His voice was tight with frustration. "I've been worried sick. Working," I replied simply, "as I do every harvest." "You threatened to bring an attorney into family business," he said, his tone incredulous. "What were you thinking? Dad is furious." "I was thinking that your father made it very clear yesterday that my position at Sullivan Estates is in jeopardy," I said. "And apparently my marriage as well." A pause. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play ignorant, Robert. Arnold told me everything. The operational restructuring plans. The strategy to remove me from decision-making now that the vineyard is successful again. He even suggested that our marriage could end if I didn't cooperate." Another silence, longer this time. When Robert spoke again, his voice had a carefully measured quality. "Grace, you're misinterpreting things. Dad can be blunt, but he would never threaten our marriage. We're just discussing some organizational changes that would free you up from day-to-day operations, give you more time for your creative projects." "Creative projects," I repeated flatly. "You mean demoting me from the position I've held for 8 years, the position that saved this business?" "That's not—" "Tell me something, Robert," I interrupted. "Did you know about the secret family trust meetings? The ones where my role was discussed without me present?" His hesitation was answer enough. "And the new financial accounts?" I pressed. "The ones with hundreds of thousands of dollars moved without my knowledge, despite my ownership stake?" "Those are legitimate business expenses," he said defensively. "Dad was just streamlining some capital investments." Capital investments I wasn't consulted on, despite being a 15% owner and the director of vineyard operations? Investments. That would directly impact the areas I manage? "Grace, please," Robert said, his voice softening into the persuasive tone he used with difficult clients. Let's not turn this into something adversarial. We're family. We can work this out. Family, I echoed. Interesting how that word only applies when it's convenient. Before he could respond, I heard a knock at the guest house door. Through the window, I could see Chloe standing outside, looking anxious. I have to go, I told Robert. Winery business. We can continue this discussion later. Grace, wait! I ended the call and opened the door for Chloe, who was shifting nervously from foot to foot. What's wrong? I asked, immediately concerned by her expression. You need to see this, she said, handing me her tablet. On the screen was an email addressed to all winery staff, sent from Robert's account just 20 minutes ago, to all Sullivan Estates employees. I'm pleased to announce an organizational change that will help position Sullivan Estates for continued growth and success. Effective immediately, Christopher Morris will be joining us as Director of Winemaking Operations, bringing his considerable experience from Morris Family Vineyards. Grace Sullivan will be transitioning to a new role as Brand Ambassador, allowing her to focus on representing Sullivan Estates to our valued distributors and customers. This strategic realignment will strengthen our operational capabilities while continuing to honor the Sullivan family tradition of excellence. The email continued, but I couldn't read anymore. They hadn't even waited for my response, hadn't even given me the courtesy of a face-to-face conversation before announcing my effective demotion to the entire staff. Christopher Morris, I said, the name feeling bitter on my tongue. Arnold's golf buddy's son. Chloe nodded. He's already here, in the winery office, with Robert and Arnold. I handed the tablet back to her, a strange calm settling over me. This wasn't just a business decision. This was a calculated humiliation. They had timed it precisely, during the middle of harvest, when I was most essential, yet most vulnerable. When walking away would mean abandoning the wines I had nurtured. From bud break to bottle. What are you going to do? Chloe asked, her eyes wide. I looked at her, young, talented, dedicated. She had joined Sullivan Estates because of me, because of the winemaking philosophy I had established. How many others on our team had done the same? I'm going to get dressed, I said with more composure than I felt. And then I'm going to meet with my attorney. Chloe frowned. Aren't you going to confront them? They can't just replace you like this. Oh, I'll confront them, I assured her. But on my terms, not theirs. After Chloe left, I quickly changed into my most professional outfit, a charcoal pantsuit I typically wore for important distributor meetings. I pulled my hair back severely, applied minimal makeup, and added only one piece of jewelry. Not my wedding ring, which I deliberately left on the nightstand, but a small golden grapevine pin that Kara had given me when our Rhone program won its first major award. On my way out, I spotted the bottle of wine I had left on the counter, the first vintage of Cabernet Franc I had produced at Sullivan Estates, the wine that had begun the vineyard's return to prominence. I had been saving it for a special occasion. This, I decided, qualified. 30 minutes later, I sat across from Abby Winters in her office in town, the bottle unopened on her desk between us. Special bottle? She asked, noting the vintage. The beginning of the story, I replied, then laid out everything. My history with Sullivan Estates, my ownership stake, the gradual erosion of my authority, and finally, the email announcing my demotion without consultation. Abby listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she looked up with sharp eyes that missed nothing. And what do you want, Grace? To fight for your position? A financial settlement? A clean break? The question caught me off guard. What did I want? For years, I had wanted recognition, respect, a place in the Sullivan family. Then, after Robert's temporary comment, I had wanted justice, validation. But now, facing the reality of their complete betrayal, I realized what I truly wanted was something else entirely. I want what's mine, I said simply. The wines I created, the vineyard blocks I saved, the business I built. I thought of the land I personally owned, the winemaking techniques I had developed, the relationships I had cultivated with growers and distributors. I thought of Chloe and the other staff members who had joined Sullivan Estates because of my leadership. The clarity was sudden and complete, like the moment in winemaking when a previously cloudy wine finally becomes brilliantly clear. I don't want to be part of Sullivan Estates anymore, I told Abby, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. I want my own operation, and I want the Sullivans to understand exactly what they're losing. Abby smiled, a small, satisfied expression. Now that, she said, reaching for the bottle I had brought, is worth opening this for. Abby Winter's office transformed into a war room over the next 2 hours. She called in her associate, who specialized in agricultural business law, and together we conducted a thorough assessment of my position, my strengths, vulnerabilities, and leverage points. Your ownership situation is unusual but potentially advantageous, Abby explained, spreading documents across her conference table. The 15% stake in Sullivan Estates gives you minority owner rights, including access to financial records and the ability to challenge certain board decisions, which is exactly why they're trying to sideline me, I noted. They want me focused on brand ambassador duties, away from operations and financials. Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Abby tapped a separate set of documents. The Eastern Vineyard parcel, your separate property that you then partially contributed to the business, that creates a unique situation. You personally own 50% of the land producing their highest-rated wines, I nodded. The Rhone program, the 96-point Grenache. Which means you have significant leverage. They can't produce those wines without your cooperation. Her associate, a thoughtful man named Mac, had been reviewing the company bylaws. There's something else. According to these documents, any major changes to operations or management structure require a 75% ownership vote. I frowned. But the Sullivan Family Trust holds 85%. Not exactly, Mac corrected. Arnold owns 30% directly. Robert owns 25% directly. The family trust holds 30%. You own 15%. The implication dawned on me. So, if Robert sided with me instead of his father and the trust, the motion wouldn't pass, Abby confirmed. Your husband is the swing vote, Grace. I leaned back, processing this information. Would Robert ever choose me over his family and their legacy? After everything that had happened, I doubted it. But it was a card I could potentially play. What? About my intellectual property? I asked. The winemaking techniques I developed, the blending protocols, the vineyard management systems, they're all documented in my notes, but we never discussed formal ownership. Abby made another note. That's trickier territory. As an employee, even one without a formal contract, work done for the company typically belongs to the company. But as a part owner and given the specialized nature of your contributions, we might have some claims there. And the winery staff? I asked. Many of them were hired because of me, trained by me. At-will employees can leave any time, Mac noted, though non-compete clauses might limit where they could work next. The assessment continued methodically. Financial resources, industry relationships, contractual obligations. By noon, we had a comprehensive picture of my position. Let me be direct, Abby said finally. You have 3 basic options. 1. Fight. To maintain your position at Sullivan Estates, using your ownership stake and Robert's potentially divided loyalties as leverage. 2. Negotiate a separation agreement that maximizes your financial compensation while allowing you a clean break. Or 3. She paused, studying me carefully before continuing. 3. You could execute a more complex strategy. Use your ownership position and land holdings to force a restructuring of Sullivan Estates itself. Essentially, turn their attempt to sideline you into an opportunity to gain greater control. The third option hung in the air, audacious and slightly shocking. Could I actually wrest control of Sullivan Estates from the family that had founded it? The family I had married into? That sounds extreme, I said cautiously. Abby shrugged. They started this with an extreme move. Announcing your demotion without consultation was a declaration of war, Grace. The question is, how do you choose to respond? I thought about Robert's betrayal, Arnold's dismissiveness, the years I'd spent being undervalued despite my contributions. Then I thought about the land, the wines, the business I'd helped build from near bankruptcy to award-winning prominence. I need to think, I said finally, and I need more information about exactly what they're planning. Reasonable, Abby agreed. But don't take too long. Based on their aggressive opening move, I suspect they have more steps planned in this transition. The email announcement was just the beginning. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. Christopher Morris is conducting a staff meeting. Reviewing all current production protocols. People are confused. My jaw tightened. They weren't wasting any time. I need to get back to the winery, I told Abby, showing her the text. They're already having my replacement review my work. With my team. Go, she advised. Observe but don't confront yet. We need to understand their full strategy before we counter. And in the meantime? I asked, gathering my things. In the meantime, I recommend you secure copies of everything. All your work, all financial records you have access to, all communications about operational decisions. Forward your emails to a personal account. Download your work from the company servers. She handed me a small external hard drive. Everything. I left with a clearer understanding of my position and a growing sense of resolve. As I drove back to Sullivan Estates, I mentally cataloged my assets, not just financial and legal, but personal. The relationships I'd built with distributors who specifically asked for my wines, the sommeliers who featured Sullivan Estates, on their lists because of my winemaking style. The wine club members who had joined during my tenure. I had been so focused on the family's rejection that I'd failed to recognize my own power base. The Sullivans might control the name, but I had created the quality and reputation that now gave that name value. When I arrived at the winery, the staff meeting had just ended. Team members were filtering out of the barrel room, expressions ranging from confused to concerned. Christopher Morris stood at the front, reviewing notes with Robert and Arnold. All three looked up as I entered. Grace, Robert said, too brightly. There you are. We were just bringing Christopher up to speed. So I heard, I replied coolly. Interesting that no one thought to include the person who developed the protocols being reviewed. Christopher, tall, conventionally handsome, dressed in the wine country uniform of expensive casual, had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Sullivan, I was hoping we'd have a chance to speak privately. I have tremendous respect for what you've accomplished here. It's Ms. Hart, professionally, I corrected, deliberately reverting to my maiden name. And I'd be happy to discuss the winemaking program I've developed. After I understand exactly what role I'm expected to play going forward, Arnold frowned. The email was quite clear, Grace. Christopher will be handling daily operations. You'll be focusing on external relations. The email was clear, I agreed. What wasn't clear was the process by which this decision was made, without consulting a 15% owner of the business. Robert stepped forward, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. Grace, let's discuss this privately. This isn't the appropriate forum. I agree, I said, surprising him. We should discuss it privately, all the owners together, a properly constituted board meeting with minutes kept and votes recorded. Arnold's face darkened. That won't be necessary for a simple organizational adjustment. According to the bylaws, any major operational change requires a 75% ownership vote, I countered. Unless you're suggesting that replacing the head winemaker during harvest isn't a major operational change? The three men exchanged glances. My knowledge of the bylaws had clearly caught them off guard. Fine. Arnold said tightly. We can formalize the decision. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, main house. I nodded. I'll be there. With my attorney. I turned and walked out before they could respond, maintaining my composure until I was safely in my truck. Only then did I allow myself a small, grim smile. They had expected me to either accept their decision meekly or react with emotional outrage. Either response would have weakened my position. Instead, I had countered with calm insistence on proper procedure, establishing myself as a serious opponent rather than a problem to be managed. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since Robert's temporary comment, I felt something close to confidence. I pulled out my phone and texted Chloe. I need access to all the winemaking records. Tonight. The response came immediately. Already downloading everything to an external drive. What they're doing isn't right. I stared at the message, a new possibility forming in my mind. I wasn't just fighting for financial compensation or professional pride. I was fighting for something I had built, something that people I had mentored and led believed in. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be fighting alone. That evening, I converted the guest house kitchen into a strategic command center. Spread. Across the counter were printouts of financial records, ownership documents, and winemaking protocols. My laptop displayed a spreadsheet I'd created, mapping out various scenarios and potential outcomes. Kara arrived with takeout and moral support. Chloe joined us after finishing her winery duties, bringing an external drive loaded with every file, from the winery's digital archives, winemaking records, customer data, supplier contracts, everything I had a legitimate right to access as part owner and head winemaker. Christopher spent the afternoon going through your fermentation records, Chloe reported, accepting a glass of wine. He seems especially interested in the native yeast protocols for the reserve program. Of course he is, I said. Those protocols took me 3 years to perfect. Morris Family Vineyards still uses commercial yeasts exclusively. I'd spent the afternoon researching Christopher Morris and his family's operation, a decent mid-sized vineyard known for reliable but unremarkable wines. Nothing innovative, nothing award-winning. The Sullivans weren't hiring him for his winemaking brilliance. They were hiring him because he was controllable, part of their social circle, someone who would follow Sullivan tradition without challenging their authority. What's the plan, Grace? Kara asked, glancing at the documents scattered around us. Fight or flight? I took a thoughtful sip of wine, one of Kara's, not a Sullivan vintage. Neither, or maybe both. Over the next hour, I outlined the strategy I'd been developing since leaving Abby's office. It wasn't just about maintaining my position or extracting a settlement. It was about transforming the situation entirely. First, I need to secure what's undeniably mine, I explained, pointing to a map of the vineyard properties. The eastern parcels I personally own half of are non-negotiable. That's where our highest-rated wines come from, and I'm not giving up control. Can you just take them? Chloe asked, looking confused. Legally, it's complicated, I admitted. I contributed those parcels to the business operation but retained 50% ownership. Disentangling them won't be simple, but Abby thinks we have a strong position. I moved to the financial printouts. Second, I need to understand exactly what they've been doing with these new accounts they've established. Some of these transfers look questionable. Large sums moved into the family trust that should have been reinvested in operations or distributed to all owners proportionally. You think they've been embezzling? Kara asked sharply. I wouldn't go that far, but they've been making financial decisions that benefit Sullivan family members at the expense of the business, and by extension, at my expense as minority owner. I turned to the staff roster. Third, I need to identify which team members might come with me if I established a separate operation. Chloe straightened immediately. I would, in a heartbeat. Her immediate loyalty touched me. I appreciate that, but I'm not asking anyone to make that choice yet. I'm still exploring options. The final piece of my strategy was the most delicate and the most personal. I need to understand where Robert stands, I said quietly. Whether there's any part of my husband left who would stand with me rather than with his family's expectations. Kara's expression was skeptical. After he let them. Announce your demotion without even discussing it with you first? I know how it looks, I acknowledged. But Robert is the swing vote according to the company bylaws. If he sided with me, which I admit is unlikely, we could block any major changes they want to make. I didn't add the other reason I needed: clarity about Robert. Despite everything, 8 years of marriage wasn't something I could simply erase. Before I made any irreversible decisions, I needed to look my husband in the eyes and understand whether our partnership, both business and personal, was truly beyond saving. So what's the immediate plan? Kara asked. For tomorrow's meeting? I pulled out a legal pad where I'd outlined my approach. Attend with legal representation. Challenge the unilateral decision-making process. Present evidence of financial irregularities. Demand restoration of my operational role. OR propose alternative. Restructuring that protects my interests. I'm not going in demanding to be reinstated, I explained. That would be playing defense on their terms. Instead, I'm going to redirect the conversation to the broader question of how Sullivan Estates should be governed moving forward. And if they refuse to engage? Chloe asked. Then I moved to Plan B, I said, flipping to another page. Formal, legal action challenging their financial decisions, coupled with a public statement about my departure that would raise serious questions for distributors, critics, and customers about the future quality of Sullivan wines. Kara whistled low. Nuclear option. They're counting on me caring more about preserving the Sullivan name and reputation than standing up for myself, I said. They're wrong. As we continued refining the strategy, my phone rang. Robert. I had been ignoring his calls all day, but now, with my plan taking shape, I felt ready to engage. I should take this, I told Kara and Chloe. They nodded and stepped outside to give me privacy. Grace, Robert said when I answered, his voice a mixture of relief and frustration. Finally, we need to talk. I agree, I replied evenly. I've been busy preparing for tomorrow's meeting. About that? Is it really necessary to bring a lawyer? This is family business. The familiar refrain. Family business. As if that excused everything. The email announcing my demotion, without consultation or warning, made it clear this isn't being handled as a family matter, I replied. So yes, legal representation is necessary. Grace, please, he said, his tone softening into the one he used when trying to persuade difficult clients. I know the announcement was handled poorly. Dad pushed it through before I could discuss it with you properly. But this change could be good for both of us. You've been working so hard for so long. Don't, I cut him off. Don't pretend this is about lightening my workload or creating opportunities. This is about the Sullivans taking back control now that I've made the business successful again. Silence stretched between us. Then, unexpectedly, Robert sighed. Can we talk? In person. Just you and me, not about business. About us. The request caught me off guard. Despite everything, a part of me still wanted to believe there was something worth saving in our relationship. Where? I asked cautiously. The Ridge Trail. Our spot. In an hour? Our spot. The overlook where he had proposed. Where we had celebrated our first successful harvest together. Where we had planned the future of Sullivan Estates in those early, hopeful days. Fine, I agreed. 1 hour. After ending the call, I rejoined Kara and Chloe. Robert wants to meet, I told them. Supposedly to talk about our marriage, not the business. Kara looked concerned. Is that wise? Before the big meeting? Probably not, I admitted. But I need to understand where he stands. if there's any chance he might support me against his father. Be careful, Chloe advised. They've already shown they're willing to blindside you. I nodded, appreciating their concern. I'll go in with eyes open, and I won't agree to anything without consulting Abby first. As Kara and Chloe gathered their things to leave, I reviewed our strategy one last time. The plan was taking shape. Clear, comprehensive, adaptable. Whether fighting to reform Sullivan Estates from within, or creating something new from what I could salvage, I was committed to reclaiming what I had built. The uncertain factor remained Robert. Was he reaching out as a husband trying to save his marriage, or as a Sullivan trying to manage a problematic situation? In an hour, I would have my answer, and the final piece I needed to complete my plan. Chiu Ridge Trail was bathed in moonlight as I made my way up the familiar path. A nearly full moon illuminated the vineyard rows below, creating a silvery patchwork across the valley floor. Any other night, I would have found it beautiful. Tonight, I felt only a hollow ache as I approached the spot where Robert waited. He stood at the wooden railing of the overlook, his silhouette outlined against the night sky. For a moment, I saw him as I had 8 years ago, hopeful, grateful, looking to me as a partner in building something meaningful. The image faded as I drew closer, replaced by the reality of the man who had allowed his family to diminish me. "Thank you for coming," he said, turning as he heard my footsteps. I stopped a few feet away, maintaining distance both physical and emotional. "What do you want to talk about, Robert?" He gestured to the bench beside the railing. "Can we sit? Please?" Reluctantly, I joined him on the bench, careful to leave space between us. Below us, Sullivan Estates spread out in all its glory. The vineyard blocks I had rehabilitated, the winery I had modernized, the visitor center I had redesigned. Everything bore my fingerprints, whether the Sullivans acknowledged it or not. "I know you're angry," Robert began, "and hurt. The way the announcement was handled was wrong." "The announcement wasn't the problem," I replied evenly. "It was just the culmination of a pattern of gradually excluding me from decisions, diminishing my contributions, treating me as temporary despite 8 years of marriage and partnership." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in the nervous gesture I knew so well. "It's complicated, Grace. The family business. There are expectations, traditions. Traditions like pushing aside someone who saved that business when it was failing? Traditions like making major financial decisions without consulting a part owner? Those traditions? That's not fair," he protested. "You've always been respected for your contributions." "Respected?" I laughed without humor. "Robert, your father told me, to my face, that marriage isn't blood, and marriages end. He made it clear that I was never truly considered part of the Sullivan legacy, no matter what I contributed." Robert looked genuinely shocked. "Dad said that? When?" "Yesterday morning, in my office. Right before you all announced my demotion without even discussing it with me first." He was silent for a long moment, staring out at the moonlit vineyard. "I didn't know," he said finally. "About what Dad said. I knew he wanted to restructure your role, but I didn't realize how it was being presented to you." I studied his profile, trying to gauge his sincerity. Was it possible he truly hadn't understood the depth of his family's dismissal? Or was this just damage control? "What did you think was happening, Robert?" I asked. "When your father scheduled meetings about operational restructuring that excluded me. When Christopher Morris was brought in without my input? What exactly did you think that meant for me, for us?" He turned to face me, his expression troubled. "I thought it was about expanding the team as we grew, adding expertise, not replacing yours." He hesitated. "And yes, I knew Dad wanted to ensure Sullivan family control for the next generation. But I never thought that meant pushing you aside. Then you haven't been paying attention, I said quietly. Or you've been deliberately ignoring what was happening because it was easier than standing up to your father. The words hung between us, neither accusation nor question, but something in between. An invitation for him to finally be honest, with me and with himself. Robert was silent for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, older somehow, less certain. Maybe you're right, he admitted. Maybe I have been avoiding the conflict. It was easier to believe this was just about organizational structure than to acknowledge what it meant for you. For us. It was the most honest thing he'd said in months, perhaps years. A small crack in the Sullivan family facade. Tomorrow at the meeting? I said carefully. The board will vote on whether to ratify the change in my position. Your father and the family trust will vote in favor. I'll vote against. You're the deciding vote, Robert. He looked away. Grace, please don't. Ask me to what? I interrupted. To stand with your wife instead of your father? To acknowledge that the business succeeded because of my expertise, not despite it? To actually be a partner in our marriage? It's not that simple, he protested. Actually, it is, I countered. Either you believe I deserve my place at Sullivan Estates based on my contributions, or you believe Sullivan blood trumps everything else. There's no middle ground here. Robert stood abruptly, pacing along the railing. What if we compromised? You could keep oversight of the Roan program. That's your baby anyway. Christopher could handle the traditional varietals. We could present it as an expansion, not a demotion. The offer confirmed everything I needed to know. He wasn't here to support me against his family. He was here to negotiate my surrender on slightly better terms. That's not a compromise, I said, rising to face him. That's just a more palatable version of the same message, that I'm expendable, that my role can be diminished whenever the Sullivan family decides it's convenient. What do you want from me, Grace? He asked, frustration edging his voice. The question hung in the air, enormous in its simplicity. What did I want from him? From our marriage? From Sullivan Estates? The answers had been evolving with each new betrayal, each confirmation that I would never truly be accepted as essential. I want what I've earned, I said finally. Recognition for what I've built, control over the wines I create, fair compensation for my ownership stake, and a husband who values me as a true partner, not a temporary helpmate to be discarded when convenient. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I do value you, he insisted. Everything Sullivan Estates is today is because of what we built together. Together, I repeated. Is that what you'll say tomorrow at the board meeting? That we built this together and should continue leading together? Or will you vote with your father to formalize my removal from operations? His hesitation was answer. Enough. I thought so, I said quietly. We stood in silence, the gulf between us widening with each passing moment. The partnership I had believed in, had sacrificed for, had poured my heart and expertise into, it had been an illusion. Not entirely, perhaps. There had been love once, and genuine collaboration. But when tested, when forced to choose between his wife and his family legacy, Robert Sullivan remained first and foremost a Sullivan. I should go, I said finally. We both need to prepare for tomorrow. As I turned to leave, Robert called after me. Grace, wait. Whatever happens at the meeting, I don't want to lose you. We can figure this out. I paused but didn't turn back. You already lost me, Robert. The moment you decided I was temporary. Walking down the moonlit path, each step took me further from the marriage I had believed in and closer to the future I now needed to secure for myself. My momentary hope that Robert might stand with me had been naive, another example of seeing what I wanted to see rather than the reality of the Sullivan family dynamics. Back at the guest house, I sent a brief update to Abby. Meeting with Robert. Confirmed he won't support me at tomorrow's vote. proceeding with our discussed strategy. Her reply came quickly. Documents ready, 8:30 at my office to review before the 9 a.m. meeting? I'll be there, I confirmed. I spent the next hour making final preparations, organizing financial records that showed questionable decisions, documenting my ownership claims to intellectual property, drafting a statement about my contributions to Sullivan Estates that could be shared with industry publications if necessary. The last item was the most difficult, a letter to Robert outlining the terms under which I would consider remaining at Sullivan Estates. They were terms I knew the family would never accept. Guaranteed operational control of winemaking for a minimum of 10 years. Complete autonomy over the Rhone program, including separate branding rights. A review of all financial decisions made by the family trust in the past year, and a revised ownership structure that would prevent any future attempts to sideline me. It wasn't an olive branch so much as a declaration of independence, a clear statement that I would no longer accept being treated as temporary, regardless of blood relations or family tradition. As I finalized my preparations, a text arrived from May. Arnold and Gloria are at the main house with their attorney. Been there for hours. Something big happening. So they were preparing their own strategy, likely anticipating that I would challenge their decision, but not that I would come armed with financial evidence and legal leverage. They still thought this was about a job title, not about ownership, rights and legal obligations. Their underestimation of me had been their pattern for years. Tomorrow, it would become their vulnerability. I called Chloe next, confirming that the backup of all winery records was complete. Everything's copied, she assured me. Production records, customer database, supplier contracts, vineyard management protocols, it's all there. And the team? I asked hesitantly, not wanting to put her in an awkward position. How are they taking all this? Her voice dropped to a near whisper. Everyone's confused. Christopher keeps saying things will continue as normal, but no one believes him. The harvest crew is asking if you'll still be overseeing crush decisions. The lab techs don't know who to report to. It's a mess. The confirmation that the operational transition was already failing provided grim satisfaction. They needed me more than they were willing to admit, especially during harvest. Just hold things together for one more day, I told her. After tomorrow's meeting, there will be clarity one way or another. My final call was to Kara, who had offered to accompany me to the meeting for moral support. Are you sure you don't want me there? She asked when I told her I would be going with just Abby. I'm sure, I replied. But I may need you afterward, whatever happens. I'll be ready, she promised, with either champagne or whiskey depending on the outcome. After hanging up, I walked to the window of the guest house, looking out at the moonlit vineyard. For 8 years, I had poured everything into this land. My knowledge, my passion, my identity. I had believed I was building something lasting, something that transcended the Sullivan name to become something uniquely mine as well. Tomorrow would determine whether any part of that belief could be salvaged, or whether it was time to start anew, building something that was entirely mine from the beginning, no family legacy to uphold, no traditions to navigate, no husband caught between loyalty to his wife and to his blood. Either way, I would no longer be defined as temporary. I would no longer accept being sidelined after years of contribution. I would no longer apologize for claiming credit for my work. The night before the confrontation, I finally understood that this fight wasn't just about a business position or even a marriage. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. The story of a woman who transformed a failing vineyard into an award-winning estate, not through blood relation but through expertise, innovation, and sheer determination. That was a legacy worth fighting for, with or without the Sullivan name attached. Morning arrived with the kind of pristine clarity that winemakers dream about during harvest. Cool air, bright sunshine, not a cloud in the sky. Perfect conditions for picking the delicate Viognier scheduled for today. Under normal circumstances, I would be in the vineyard at dawn, testing sugar levels, calculating the ideal moment to signal the picking crews. Instead, I was in Abby Winters' office at 8:15 a.m., dressed in a tailored navy suit that I typically reserved for important distributor meetings, reviewing our strategy one final time. "Remember," Abby advised as we went through the documentation spread across her conference table, "we're not just responding to their action, we're setting the agenda with our counterproposal." I nodded, focusing on the papers before me instead, of the storm of emotions threatening my composure. Despite my preparation, despite my certainty that I was fighting for what was rightfully mine, the personal dimension of this confrontation weighed heavily. In less than an hour, I would be sitting across from my husband and in-laws not as family, but as business adversaries. "The financial records are our strongest leverage," Abby continued, tapping a folder containing printouts of questionable transactions. "Without proper disclosure to minority shareholders, that's you, these movements of funds potentially constitute breach of fiduciary duty." "Arnold will claim they were legitimate business expenses," I said. "Investments in future growth." "Let him," Abby replied with a tight smile. "The burden of proof will be on them to demonstrate these were proper business decisions rather than preferential allocations to family members." As we finalized our approach, my phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Where are you? Meeting starts in 30 minutes." I showed the message to Abby, who raised an eyebrow. "Interesting that he's texting you. Directly rather than going through me, now that he knows you have legal representation. He's trying to maintain the fiction that this is still a family matter," I said, not bothering to respond to his message. "As if I should just show up alone and let them dictate terms." "Well," Abby said, gathering her materials into a sleek, leather portfolio, "they're about to discover that fiction no longer works." The drive to Sullivan Estates felt surreal, as if I were seeing the familiar landscape through new eyes. The rolling hills with their neat rows of vines, the stately entrance with its stone pillars bearing the Sullivan crest, the winding driveway, lined with olive trees that I had personally selected and planted, all of it both intimately familiar and suddenly foreign. Abby parked her Mercedes beside several other vehicles already at the main house: Arnold's Range Rover, Gloria's Lexus, and an unfamiliar black sedan that likely belonged to their attorney. Robert's car was conspicuously absent. "Ready?" Abby asked as we gathered our materials. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "Absolutely." We were met at the door by Gloria, whose carefully composed smile faltered at the sight of Abby beside me. "Grace," she said, her voice overly bright. "And this must be your attorney." "Abby Winters," Abby introduced herself with professional crispness. "Counsel for Grace Hart Sullivan." The deliberate use of my hyphenated name, which I rarely used in daily life at the vineyard, was not lost on Gloria. It was a small reminder that I had an identity independent of the Sullivan legacy. "Everyone's in the dining room," Gloria said, leading us through the house. "We thought it would be more comfortable than a formal conference setting." Another attempt to frame this as a family discussion rather than a business negotiation. I exchanged a knowing glance with Abby as we followed Gloria through the familiar hallways, past photos of Sullivan generations that conspicuously minimized my presence despite my central role in the current era of the business. The dining room had been arranged for the meeting, with documents and water glasses set at each place around the large oak table. Arnold sat at the head, with an older man in an expensive suit, presumably their attorney, to his right. Christopher Morris sat uncomfortably beside them, looking out of place and uncertain. Robert stood by the window, turning as we entered. "Grace," he said, stepping forward, "I thought we might speak privately before—" "My client is here for the scheduled board meeting," Abby interrupted smoothly. "Any private discussions can occur after formal business is concluded." Robert's expression tightened, but he nodded, gesturing to 2 empty chairs. Of course. Please, sit down. I took my seat across from Christopher Morris, meeting his gaze directly. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, glancing away quickly. Whatever he had been told about my role and the transition, he was now witnessing firsthand the reality of the situation. Arnold cleared his throat. Well, since we're all here, we can begin. This is James Harrington, our family attorney. He gestured to the older man beside him, who nodded politely but warily toward Abby. Let's start with the agenda, Arnold continued, pushing a single sheet of paper toward us. As you can see, we have just one item of business, to formalize the operational restructuring announced yesterday. Abby didn't even glance at the paper. Before we proceed, my client would like to address several preliminary matters. This meeting has a specific purpose, Arnold said firmly. We can discuss other business at a later date. I'm afraid these matters directly impact today's agenda, Abby countered. Specifically, concerns about improper financial activities that need to be resolved before any organizational changes can be considered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Arnold's face darkened while his attorney sat up straighter, suddenly alert. What exactly are you implying? James Harrington asked, his tone carefully neutral. Abby opened her portfolio and removed the first set of documents, sliding them across the table. These financial records show substantial transfers from Sullivan Estates' operational accounts to the Sullivan Family Trust over the past 6 months. Transfers made without proper disclosure to or approval from all shareholders, including my client who owns 15% of the business. Arnold's expression hardened. Those were legitimate capital investments. The trust is developing new opportunities for the vineyard. Without board approval? Abby asked mildly. Without informing a 15% owner about the disposition of nearly $2 million in company funds? That's a rather unorthodox approach to corporate governance, Mr. Sullivan. Robert had gone pale, staring at the financial records spread before us. Whether he was surprised by the evidence or merely by our knowledge of it, I couldn't tell. We have complete documentation of these transfers, I added, speaking for the first time, along with meeting minutes from Sullivan Family Trust gatherings, where operational decisions about the vineyard were made without my knowledge or input, despite my ownership stake. Grace, Arnold said, his voice dropping into the patronizing tone I had heard so many times before. These are technical matters that don't require involvement from everyone. The trust was simply streamlining certain processes. Processes like removing me from operational control? I asked directly. Because those trust meeting minutes specifically reference repositioning me and ensuring Sullivan control of winemaking decisions. Planning that apparently began months ago. The room fell silent. Christopher Morris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly realizing he had stepped into a far more complicated situation than he had been led to believe. Perhaps, James Harrington said carefully, we should take a brief recess to discuss these concerns privately before proceeding with the agenda. There's no need, I said firmly. I'm not here to negotiate minor adjustments to your plan. I'm here to present an alternative approach. I nodded to Abby, who removed another document from her portfolio and placed it in the center of the table. This is a formal counterproposal, she explained. Ms. Hart Sullivan is prepared to continue her association with Sullivan Estates under the following conditions. Full operational control of all winemaking activities, guaranteed by contract for a minimum of 10 years. Separate branding and profit. Participation for the Rhone program she developed. A complete audit of all financial transfers between Sullivan Estates and the family trust over the past year. And a revised operating agreement that requires unanimous board approval for any major operational changes. Arnold stared at the document as if it were a snake that had suddenly appeared on his dining table. This is absurd, he sputtered. You can't dictate terms like this. The Sullivan family has final say in how this business operates. Actually, Abby replied calmly, corporate law dictates how this business operates. and corporate law is quite clear about the rights of minority shareholders and the fiduciary duties of majority owners. Robert finally broke his silence. Grace, surely we can discuss this reasonably, as a family. We're past that point, Robert, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. Your family made that clear when they planned my removal behind my back and announced it without consultation. Now we're addressing this as a business matter, with appropriate legal protections. And if we refuse these terms? Arnold demanded. This was the moment of no return. The point at which I would irrevocably transform my relationship with the Sullivans and with the vineyard I had helped build. Once these words were spoken, there would be no going back to the pretense of family harmony, no maintaining the illusion that I was a respected partner rather than a temporarily useful outsider. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me as I prepared to cross this final threshold. If you refuse these terms, I said clearly, I will initiate legal action to protect my ownership interests, including challenging the financial transfers already made. I will exercise my right to have the Eastern Vineyard parcels formally valued and separated from general operations, since I own 50% of that land outright. I will notify wine critics, distributors, and industry publications that I am no longer involved in winemaking at Sullivan Estates, raising immediate questions about future quality and consistency. I paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the final blow. And I will begin the process of establishing my own independent winemaking operation, taking with me the techniques, relationships, and expertise that have been responsible for Sullivan Estates' success over the past 8 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Christopher Morris looked stunned, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what he had stepped into. You would destroy everything we've built? Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Out of pride? No, Robert, I corrected him. I would protect what I've built. There's a difference. And it's not pride, it's self-respect and professional integrity. Something your family should understand, given how fiercely you protect your own legacy. Arnold had gone from flushed anger to calculating stillness. And the marriage? He asked bluntly. Is that also a bargaining chip in your strategy? The directness of the question caught me off guard, but I maintained my composure. My marriage is between Robert and me. But you've made it abundantly clear that in your eyes, marriage isn't blood, and marriages end. I'm simply proceeding with the understanding that my professional contributions need to be secured independently of my marital status. Robert flinched as his own father's words were repeated back to them. For the first time, I saw genuine regret in his expression, not just concern about the business implications, but recognition of the personal damage that had been done. James. Harrington leaned over to whisper something to Arnold, who nodded tersely before addressing us again. We need time to review these demands, he said, the word clearly distasteful to him. I propose we adjourn for 48 hours to consider our response. Abby looked to me for confirmation. I nodded slightly. My client agrees to a 48-hour adjournment, she said, with the understanding that all operational changes announced yesterday are suspended pending resolution of these matters. Arnold's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Fine. Christopher will postpone assuming full duties until we've reached an agreement. Christopher looked relieved, clearly happy to step back from the brewing conflict. As the meeting broke up, Robert approached me while the others gathered their materials. Grace, he said quietly, can we please talk? Privately? I studied his face, the face I had woken up beside for 8 years. The face that had once looked at me with gratitude and admiration. Now I saw confusion, hurt, and fear. But I also saw calculation. Robert Sullivan was nothing if not strategic when it came to protecting family interests. Not now, I said finally. I think we've all said what needed to be said for today. This isn't what I wanted, he insisted. You have to know that. What you wanted was for me to quietly accept a diminished role after years of building this business, I replied. What you wanted was for me to prioritize the Sullivan legacy over my own professional standing. What you wanted was convenience. Robert, not partnership. His expression confirmed the truth of my assessment. Even now, he was thinking about how to manage the situation, not how to make it right. 48 hours, I said, gathering my things. We'll see where we all stand. Then, as Abby and I walked out of the house, I felt the weight of a decision that could not be unmade. I had drawn my line in the sand, clearly and unequivocally. I had declared my value and my terms. I had refused to be temporary any longer. Whatever came next, whether a restructured role at Sullivan Estates or a complete separation and new beginning, I had reclaimed my own narrative. The Sullivans would never again see me as merely an accessory to their family legacy. In that moment, stepping into the bright autumn sunshine outside the Sullivan family home, I felt something unexpected amid the tension and uncertainty. Freedom. The 48 hours passed in a strange limbo of intense activity and weighted silence. I spent most of that time at the winery, personally overseeing the Viognier harvest and initial processing, working alongside the confused but loyal staff who seemed relieved to still have my guidance during this critical time. Christopher Morris made himself scarce, appearing only briefly to observe operations from a distance before retreating to the administrative offices. The staff viewed him with obvious skepticism, an outsider attempting to replace someone who had earned their respect through years of hands-on leadership. Robert tried repeatedly to arrange a private conversation, sending texts that evolved from demanding to pleading as the hours passed. I maintained my distance, responding only with brief, professional updates about harvest operations. Our personal relationship would need to wait until the business situation was resolved. By the morning of the scheduled follow-up meeting, word had spread throughout the wine community that something significant was happening at Sullivan Estates. Kara reported that industry friends were calling her, fishing for information about why I hadn't been at a regional winemaker's dinner the previous evening, an event I never missed. People aren't idiots, she told me over coffee at her winery. Everyone knows you built Sullivan Estates into what it is today. If you suddenly disappear from operations, questions will be asked. That reality was undoubtedly weighing on the Sullivans as they considered their response to my terms. The timing couldn't have been worse for them. Middle of harvest, beginning of the pre-holiday sales season, with wine critics scheduled to visit in the coming weeks. Any disruption now could impact not just this year's vintage, but the vineyard's reputation for years to come. I arrived at the Sullivan main house precisely at 9 a.m., once again accompanied by Abby. This time, the atmosphere felt different, tense but less hostile, as if the family had moved from outrage to calculation. We were shown into Arnold's study rather than the dining room, a space that had always been exclusively Sullivan territory. The walls were lined with photos of 3 generations of Sullivan, men posed in the vineyard, alongside framed reviews of their wines and various industry awards. I noted with grim amusement that several of the most prominently displayed accolades were for wines I had created. Arnold sat behind his massive oak desk, with James Harrington beside him. Robert stood by the window, looking as if he hadn't slept. There was no sign of Christopher Morris or Gloria. "Thank you for coming," Arnold said formally as we took our seats. The belligerent tone from our previous meeting was gone, replaced by careful neutrality. "We've reviewed your proposal," he continued, "and while we find some elements problematic, we recognize that compromise is necessary given the current situation." Abby maintained a professional poker face, but I could sense her satisfaction. The Sullivans were prepared to negotiate rather than dictate, already a significant shift in our relative positions. Harrington slid a document across the desk. "We've drafted a counter-proposal that we believe addresses your core concerns while preserving certain fundamental elements of Sullivan Estates' governance structure." Abby took the document, scanning it quickly before passing it to me. The terms were surprisingly reasonable. A 5-year contract as director of winemaking operations, with guaranteed autonomy over production decisions. Complete control over the Rhone program with separate labeling under Sullivan Estates, Grace Collection. A seat on the newly formalized board of directors with veto rights over any changes to winemaking operations. What was conspicuously missing was any mention of the financial issues I had raised, or any changes to the ownership structure that would prevent future attempts to sideline me. This addresses the operational concerns, I noted, but not the financial irregularities or governance issues. What about the transfers to the family trust? Arnold's expression tightened. Those were legitimate business investments. Then you shouldn't object to a full audit and regular financial reporting to all shareholders, I countered, including detailed disclosure of how trust funds related to Sullivan Estates are allocated. A tense silence followed as Arnold and Harrington exchanged glances. We could agree to quarterly financial reporting, Harrington offered cautiously, with reasonable detail about major capital expenditures. And the historical transfers? Abby pressed. My client requires a full accounting of Sullivan Estates funds that have been moved to the family trust over the past year. That's family. Business, Arnold said firmly. It's shareholder business, I corrected him, when company funds are involved. Robert, who had been silently watching this exchange, finally spoke. Dad, we should agree to this. If everything was legitimate as you say, there's nothing to hide, and Grace has a right to know how company money is being spent. Arnold's expression of surprise mirrored my own. This was the first time Robert had openly sided with me against his father's position. Fine, Arnold conceded after a moment. A full accounting of transfers between Sullivan Estates and the family trust for the past 12 months, but conducted by our existing accounting firm, not outside auditors. Acceptable, provided my client receives complete documentation, not just summary reports, Abby countered. The negotiations continued for another hour, each side giving ground incrementally until we arrived at a revised agreement that contained most of what I had demanded. I would retain operational control of winemaking with contractual protections. The Rhone program would become a separately branded line under my direct supervision. Financial reporting would be transparent and regular, and any future organizational changes affecting my areas of responsibility would require my explicit approval. There's one more item, I said as we neared conclusion. My ownership stake. I want it increased to 20%. Arnold's face flushed. Absolutely not. The ownership structure is non-negotiable. My contribution to Sullivan Estates' current value far exceeds 15%, I replied calmly. I'm not asking for equal ownership with family members, just fair recognition of my role in building this business. The original agreement was 15%, Harrington interjected. That was the deal when you joined the company. That was before I transformed a failing vineyard into an award-winning estate, I countered. Before I created wines that earned national recognition. Before I developed sustainable farming practices that increased both quality and profitability. 17%? Robert said suddenly. We could restructure to give Grace 17%. Arnold turned to his son with a look of betrayal. That would dilute the family shares. It would recognize reality, Robert replied, meeting his father's gaze steadily. Sullivan Estates wouldn't exist in its current form without Grace. We all know that, even if we don't say it aloud. The admission, public, unequivocal, hung in the air between us. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Robert had acknowledged my true value to the business in terms his father couldn't dismiss. 18%, I countered, pressing my advantage, with the additional shares coming proportionally from existing shareholders. Arnold looked as if he might explode, but Harrington placed a restraining hand on his arm, leaning in to whisper something. After a tense moment, Arnold nodded tersely. 17.5%, he said grudgingly. Final offer. I glanced at Abby, who gave a slight nod. Acceptable. As Harrington made notes for the final agreement, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The business issues were being resolved, but the personal fractures remained raw and exposed. I believe we've addressed all the material points, Harrington said finally. I'll have the revised agreement prepared for signatures by tomorrow morning. There's one more thing, I said, looking directly at Arnold. An apology. His head snapped. Excuse me? I want an acknowledgement, on record, that the attempt to diminish my role was inappropriate and that my contributions to Sullivan Estates are essential to its success. Not just in a contract that no one else sees, but in a formal statement to the staff and external partners. You're pushing too far, Arnold growled. Actually, I replied calmly, I'm insisting on the bare minimum of professional respect. After 8 years of building this business, I deserve public recognition of my role, not to be dismissed as temporary help or sidelined without consultation. Robert stepped forward. She's right, Dad. We handled this terribly, and we owe Grace an apology. I owe her an apology. Arnold looked between his son and me, clearly struggling with the humiliation of having to formally acknowledge his mistake. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Fine. We'll issue a statement clarifying your ongoing role and the unfortunate miscommunication about the organizational changes. Not miscommunication, I insisted. Mistake. You made a mistake in attempting to remove me from operations. That needs to be clear. Another tense silence. Then, agreed. With that final concession, the meeting concluded. Abby and Harrington made arrangements to finalize the documentation, while Arnold excused himself with barely concealed relief. Robert remained behind, waiting until the others had left before approaching me. Can we talk now? He asked quietly. Just the two of us? I studied him, the man I had married, the partner I had believed in, the husband who had failed to stand beside me when it mattered most. Today, he had finally shown glimmers of the person I thought I knew. But was it too little? Too late? Yes, I said finally. I think it's time we talked about us. We walked in silence to the Ridge Trail overlook, our spot, the place where our journey together had begun with such hope and where, just days ago, I had realized how far apart we had grown. I'm sorry, Robert said as we reached the familiar bench. I know those words aren't enough, but I need to say them anyway. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you. I'm sorry I let my father's vision of Sullivan Estates override our partnership. I'm sorry I ever made you feel temporary. The apology seemed genuine, but I needed more than words. Why? I asked simply. Why did you let it happen? Why did you choose family legacy over our marriage? Robert was silent for a long moment, staring out at the vineyard spread below us. I've been asking myself the same question for the past 2 days, he said finally. The easy answer is that it's how I was raised. Sullivan blood, Sullivan tradition, Sullivan way of doing things. I never questioned it until I met you. He turned to face me directly. But the real answer is that I was a coward. It was easier to go along with what Dad wanted than to fight for what I knew was right. Easier to tell myself this was just a business decision than to acknowledge what it said about how I valued you, as a wife, as a partner, as the woman I love. Love? I echoed, the word feeling foreign after everything that had happened. Can you really say that after what you've done? Yes, he said simply. I can say it because it's true, even if I've done a terrible job of showing it. I love you, Grace. I love the woman who saw potential in this place when it was failing. I love the woman who works harder than anyone I've ever known to create something exceptional. I love the woman who finally forced me to stand up to my father and acknowledge what's right. His words stirred something in me, a faint echo of what I had once felt so strongly. But trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with a single conversation, no matter how heartfelt. "I don't know if that's enough anymore," I said honestly. "You betrayed me, Robert. Not just professionally, but personally. You let your family plan to push me aside after everything I've contributed, everything we've built together." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'll spend every day trying to make that right, if you'll let me. The question is, do you want to try? Or is our marriage part of what you consider temporary now?" It was the question I had been asking myself since that fateful harvest dinner. Did I want to salvage what remained of our relationship, or was it time to make a completely fresh start, professionally and personally? "I don't know," I admitted. "I need time. We need time. The business arrangement we've negotiated gives us space to see if we can rebuild trust professionally. Whether that extends to our marriage, I can't answer that today." Robert nodded, disappointment evident in his expression, but also understanding. "That's fair, more than fair considering." As we walked back down the trail, a light breeze stirred. The vineyard rose below, rustling the leaves of vines heavy with fruit waiting to be transformed into wine. The harvest would continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, the endless cycle of growth, transformation, and renewal that had drawn me to winemaking in the first place. Whatever happened between Robert and me personally, I had secured my professional future at Sullivan Estates. Not as temporary help, not as a silent partner, but as an essential, acknowledged leader whose contributions were now formally recognized and protected. The Sullivan family had finally been forced to see me as I truly was. Not an outsider to be tolerated, but the architect of their renewed success, a partner with the power to shape their future. And they would never make the mistake of calling me temporary again. The following morning, the formal restructuring agreement was signed, in Arnold's study with all parties present, including Gloria, who maintained a tight-lipped silence throughout the proceedings. Christopher Morris had already departed, his brief tenure as director of winemaking operations ending before it truly began. Immediately after the signing, Arnold called an all-staff meeting in the barrel room. The gathering had a palpable tension, as employees filed in, exchanging uncertain glances and whispered speculations. Everyone had witnessed the power struggle of the past few days, even if they hadn't known the details. I stood at the back, watching as Arnold took position at the front, his posture rigid with the discomfort of what he was about to do. Robert stood beside him, while Gloria remained seated at a distance, her expression unreadable. "Thank you all for coming," Arnold began, his voice carrying across the cavernous space. "As you know, there has been some confusion about organizational changes here at Sullivan Estates. I want to clarify the situation." He paused, visibly struggling with the next words. Robert gave him a pointed look, and Arnold continued with obvious reluctance. "The announcement regarding Grace's role was premature and incorrect. It was a mistake on our part." The admission seemed physically painful for him. "Grace will continue as director of winemaking operations with expanded authority, including exclusive control over our new Rhone program, which will launch as Sullivan Estates Grace Collection next year." A ripple of relief passed through the staff. Chloe, standing near the front, couldn't contain a small smile as she glanced back at me. "Additionally," Arnold continued, "Grace's ownership stake in Sullivan Estates has been increased to reflect her significant contributions to our success." Robert stepped forward. "What my father is trying to say," he said, his voice warmer and more genuine, "is that we recognize that Sullivan Estates wouldn't be what it is today without Grace's expertise, vision, and dedication. The attempt to change her role was a serious error in judgment, and we apologize, both to Grace and to all of you who were left in an uncertain position." The staff's reaction was immediate. Expressions of relief, nods of approval, even a few scattered claps. They had known all along who was truly responsible for the vineyard's renaissance, regardless of the family name on the gate. As the meeting concluded and people returned to their harvest duties, the atmosphere throughout the winery visibly lightened. Chloe approached me, barely containing her excitement. "So you did it," she said, keeping her voice low. "You made them acknowledge what everyone already knew." "We did what was necessary," I replied simply. "For the business and for everyone who works here." Throughout the day, I received a steady stream of congratulations from staff members, some spoken directly, others conveyed through subtle nods or appreciative glances. It was clear that my stand against the Sullivans had earned me not just legal protections, but deeper respect from the team. By evening, news had spread beyond our property. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from industry colleagues, most veiling their curiosity behind congratulations on the new Grace collection announcement that Robert had already shared with key distributors. Kara didn't bother with pretense when she called. "So," she said without preamble, "you went from nearly fired to having your own branded collection and increased ownership? Tell me everything." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. Let's just say the Sullivans discovered I wasn't as temporary as they thought. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything at Sullivan Estates, I stood in the lab analyzing samples from the barrels that held our most recent vintage. The Rhone varietals were developing beautifully, showing the complex aromatics and balanced structure I had envisioned when planting those vineyards years ago. "The Grenache is exceptional this year," Chloe observed, making notes as we tasted. "The Grace collection debut is going to make a serious splash." I smiled at the name that now officially distinguished the wines I created from the traditional Sullivan portfolio. The label design had been finalized last month, elegant and distinctive, with my signature incorporated subtly into the vineyard sketch that formed the background. The past 6 months had brought significant changes to Sullivan Estates, most notably in the family dynamics. Arnold had retreated somewhat from daily operations, focusing instead on the ambassador role that they had originally planned for me. He was more comfortable in the social aspects of the wine business anyway, hosting VIP tastings, attending industry events, telling stories about Sullivan family heritage. Gloria had maintained a cool politeness toward me, neither openly hostile nor particularly warm. She seemed to have accepted the new reality without embracing it, recognizing that the business needed me, even if she personally did not. The most profound changes had been with Robert. True to his word, he had worked diligently to rebuild trust, supporting my decisions publicly, ensuring I received proper credit for my work, and maintaining transparent financial reporting. Professionally, our relationship had found a new equilibrium based on mutual respect, rather than his family's expectations. Personally, things remained complicated. I had moved back into the main house after a month in the guest house, but our marriage was still healing. We were essentially dating each other again, scheduled dinners, careful conversations, rediscovering common ground beyond the business that had consumed us both for so long. "The Wine Enthusiast writer is coming next week for the feature," Chloe reminded me, bringing my attention back to the present. First major profile since the restructuring. The upcoming article would tell the story of Sullivan Estates' evolution, including my expanded role and the new collection bearing my name. It represented the public acknowledgement I had fought for, recognition not just within the company but throughout the industry. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Distributor meeting finished early. Dinner tonight?" I smiled slightly as I replied, "Yes. The new restaurant in town?" His response came quickly. "Perfect. Just us. Just us." It was what we were trying to find our way back to, a relationship defined by genuine connection rather than business necessity or family obligation. As I finished the barrel tasting and walked through the sun-dappled vineyard back to my office, I reflected on the journey of the past year, from feeling temporary and disposable to securing my rightful place. From questioning my marriage to cautiously rebuilding it. From being seen as an outsider to having my name literally on the bottle. The vines around me were entering a new growing season, tender shoots reaching skyward with the promise of another vintage, another opportunity for transformation. Like them, I was growing in new directions, not as someone's wife or someone's daughter-in-law, but as myself. Grace Hart Sullivan, winemaker, business owner, woman who had refused to be erased, no longer temporary but essential, no longer invisible, but acknowledged, no longer uncertain, but firmly rooted in the legacy I had earned, a legacy that would continue to evolve and flourish with each passing season. 1 year to the day after Robert's fateful temporary comment at the harvest dinner, we gathered again at the long table set among the vines. The setting sun cast golden light across the vineyard, glinting off glasses filled with the first official release of the Grace Collection Grenache, a wine that had already received a pre-release score of 98 points from Wine Advocate. The dinner. Guests included many of the same family members and friends who had witnessed my public diminishment a year ago. But the dynamics had shifted dramatically. Where I had once been relegated to the background, I now sat at the head of the table. Opposite Robert, my position both symbolic and earned, Arnold raised his glass as twilight settled over the vineyard. "To Sullivan Estates," he began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition, "and to the Grace Collection. May they both continue to flourish." The acknowledgement was genuine, if still, somewhat difficult for him. Over the past year, he had come to accept, even grudgingly appreciate, that my distinct vision complemented, rather than threatened the Sullivan legacy. After dinner, as guests mingled and enjoyed the wine, May approached me with a knowing smile. "Quite a difference from last year," she observed. "Indeed," I agreed, looking around at the gathering, though I never imagined this is how things would unfold. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when Arnold's brother called me temporary help 30 years ago, I just accepted it. I spent decades trying to prove my worth to a family that was never going to truly see me." She patted my hand warmly. "Thank you for refusing to do the same." Her words resonated deeply. By standing firm, I hadn't just changed my own situation. I had perhaps shifted something fundamental in how the Sullivan family viewed those who married into their world. Later that evening, Robert and I walked the ridge trail alone, the valley spread out below us in moonlit splendor. Our marriage had found a new footing over the past year, not perfect, but honest in a way it hadn't been before. The crisis had stripped away pretense, forcing us to decide what we truly valued in each other beyond business considerations or family expectations. "A year ago, I nearly lost everything that matters," Robert said quietly as we reached our spot at the overlook. "Not just you, but my integrity, my ability to look myself in the mirror and recognize the man I wanted to be." I took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses from vineyard work. We both had to decide what we were willing to fight for, what was truly essential rather than temporary. "And what did you decide?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of the vulnerability that had been absent for so long in our marriage. "That I would never again let anyone define my value or my place," I said honestly. "Not even you. That my work speaks for itself and deserves recognition. That partnership means standing together, especially when it's difficult." He nodded, accepting this truth. "And us? Our marriage?" I looked out over Sullivan Estates, the land we had nurtured together, the business we had built, the future still unfolding before us. "Our marriage isn't temporary," I said finally. "But it isn't guaranteed either. It's something we choose every day, something we build with intention and respect." As we stood there in the moonlight, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from being dismissed as temporary to running significant portions of the family, business had transformed not just my professional standing but my understanding of my own worth. Had discovered that true belonging isn't granted by others, It's claimed by having the courage to stand firm in your value, to refuse erasure, to insist on recognition for what you've built. Now, when I walked through Sullivan Estates, I did so, not as someone's wife or a tolerated outsider, but as a woman who had earned every inch of her place in this world through expertise, determination, and an unwavering belief in her own worth. Never again would anyone dare call me temporary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.